can you explain why there was this huge shift in our society of like, if you look back 100 years ago, there was never like the processed packaged foods in the grocery store that we see today. And now like we have so many options and people don't understand why it's so unhealthy. And maybe the food group isn't bad, but the way it's prepared, like you said, is causing all the damage. Why was this such a big shift in our society, especially in America, that caused people to start to have more health issues?
Yeah. It really started back in like when industrialization in the US started in the 1800s. Cities started to become much more populated, like rural areas. People were fleeing rural areas. It was like a brain drain from rural America to urban cities. And so that was like a tipping point for the food system. Mm-hmm. Food now needed to be much more closely located to denser populations, but we had fewer manpower on those farms to create the food that we needed. So technology needed to keep up. And that ultimately led to the industrialization of food. And the process of making food through an industrial process really has led us to eat a lot more highly processed foods. Mm. So I think the easiest way to think about it is you have real foods and you have highly processed foods. And real foods are things that are just God foods, grown from the earth. They're single ingredient. They're usually just raw materials for simple recipes. Like your grandmother's cookbook will just be full of real foods. Yeah. And then everything else is new. It's just a new version of food, and it's a play on these real foods. So we've just turned, like many things, we've just turned it into this industrial process where we're going to mass produce all of these ingredients at scale, and then we're going to run it through this multi-step process to get these food-like substances in a form where it's edible, mm-hmm. but they're really just edible food-like substances. So the shift really started happening in the 1800s, but it's just sped up so much through the different wars, so like World War I and World War II. Helped increase the capacity for the U.S. to industrialize food, because we had all these factories that were once making military equipment now kind of empty.
Right.
So we have this workforce that is like used to working in the factories, and then we have these factories that are capable of making these foods, and then from there it's just a matter of kind of the system catching up with it. So we have like regulations around food starting to talk about, food safety and what we can and can't do with food. And so, the early part of the 1900s, there was a huge battle around the pasteurization of milk and milk safety. Mm-hmm. And that's changed milk forever. And then in the middle part of the century, we had a lot of guidelines starting to be formed around what we should and shouldn't eat. And that kind of came and coincided with incentives and subsidies in the food system that promoted us growing more corn, wheat, and soy. So all those factors have kind of blended together to create this like ultra processed food giant in this industry. It's like the evil boss at the end of a video game. Yeah. Like that's the ultra processed food industry. And it's taken many steps and many iterations to get there. But what we have today is so different than what we had 100 years ago for mm-hmm. food. Like even varieties of food. Like we only eat the Cornish cross chicken. Like that's basically the only chicken that exists today. And there are estimates that 40% of the protein consumption in the U.S. is going to be coming from chicken by the year 2030. So what does that say? It's like we've taken the genetics of all of these different breeds of chickens, diluted it down to one breed, and then hyperbred that one chicken. It can't be that good, right? Like diversity is a cornerstone of like health in nature. So if we're breeding away all these other breeds and focusing on this one, you're really leaving that one breed to be susceptible to all these different types of diseases. Mm-hmm. And that's when we've now started to introduce like massive amounts of antibiotics into the food system, which Tyson, which is the largest producer of chicken, 7 years ago said they're never going to use antibiotics in their chicken. And they've since reversed that because they realize it's not really all that possible now.
Yeah. What happened with glyphosate recently? Is organic produce? I think I saw you post something about that. Is it like allowed
Yeah,
now?
I th- I might get this wrong, but I think that now there's like a loophole way that glyphosate is able to be classified as organic, whereas previously organic had meant that there was no glyphosate
Yeah.
included. And that's the other thing. It's like the information, the regulatory window just like keeps shifting
Yeah.
slightly when no one's really looking, right?
Yeah.
Like glyphosate is one of these things where the studies might say that glyphosate's not all that bad for you. There's millions of lawsuits against Monsanto that are claiming that people are getting cancer from the use of glyphosate on these crops. So, I think there's plenty of evidence showing that glyphosate is a harmful chemical, especially when it's being sprayed on our food in the way that it is today. And now that organic labels can introduce glyphosate into their characterization, that's pretty scary.